The morning of August 4th, 1950, dawned with the acrid smell of smoke and the distant thunder of artillery echoing across the hills of southeastern Korea. Lieutenant General Walton Walker stood atop a ridge overlooking the Nakdong River, his weathered hands gripping a pair of binoculars as he surveyed the chaos below. The remnants of the 8th United States Army, alongside their South Korean allies, had been pushed back to what would become known as the Psan Perimeter, desperate last stand that would determine the fate of the Korean peninsula. The situation was beyond critical. In just over a month since the North Korean People's Army had crossed the 38th parallel, on June 25th, the Communist forces had swept through South Korea like a devastating flood. Seoul had fallen within days, and now the defenders found themselves compressed into a roughly rectangular area around the vital port city of Psan, their backs literally to the sea. Walker's forces controlled barely 10% of South Korea's territory, and the enemy was pressing forward with relentless determination. Major General William Dean, commander of the 24th Infantry Division, had been captured during the chaotic retreat from Daejeon just 3 days earlier. His loss sent shockwaves through the American command structure, as Dean had been one of the few experienced combat leaders available in the early days of the conflict. The news of his capture spread quickly through the ranks, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already precarious situation. According to historical accounts documented by military historian Roy Appelman in his comprehensive work South to the Nakdong, North to the Yalu, the American forces were woefully unprepared for the intensity of the North Korean assault. The soldiers, many of whom had been enjoying occupation duty in Japan, suddenly found themselves thrust into a brutal conflict against a well-trained and highly motivated enemy. The perimeter itself stretched approximately 140 miles in length, running roughly from the coastal town of Pohang in the north, west along the Nakdong River, then south to the port of Psan. Within this confined space, Walker commanded approximately 92,000 troops, including for American divisions and several South Korean units. Facing them were an estimated 70,000 North Korean soldiers, backed by Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery. As Walker lowered his binoculars, he could see the dust clouds rising from advancing North Korean columns. The enemy had already established several bridgeheads across the Nakdong River, and their T-34 tanks were proving devastatingly effective against the lightly armed American infantry. The situation was so dire that evacuation plans for Psan had already been drawn up, with ships standing by to remove both military personnel and equipment. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Walker's shoulders. He knew that if the perimeter collapsed, it would not only mean the loss of South Korea, but could potentially trigger a wider conflict that might engulf the entire region. The stakes could not be higher, and time was running out. In the distance, the sound of small arms fire crackled like deadly fireworks, a constant reminder that the enemy was closing in. From all sides, the sweltering heat of August 8th, 1950, made every movement a struggle as Captain John Mitchell led his company of the 1st Cavalry Division through the dusty streets of Daegu. The city, located in the heart of the Psan perimeter, had become a critical stronghold that absolutely could not fall. If Daegu were lost, the entire defensive line would collapse like a house of cards, and the road to Psan would lie wide open. Mitchell's men were exhausted. They had been fighting almost continuously for 2 weeks, moving from one crisis point to another as North Korean forces probed for weaknesses in the American defenses. The captain himself had not slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch in days, and the strain was showing on his gaunt face. His uniform was stained with sweat and dirt, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much death in too short a time. The North Korean 1st Division had launched a massive assault on the city's northern approaches at dawn, supported by their fearsome T-34 tanks. The distinctive rumble of these Soviet-made machines had become a sound of terror for the American infantry, who had learned through bitter experience that their bazookas and recoilless rifles were largely ineffective against the tanks' thick armor. Only the recently arrived M26 Pershing tanks could match them in direct combat, but there were precious few of these available. As Mitchell's company moved into position near the city's railway station, they could hear the battle raging in the northern suburbs. The crack of rifle fire was punctuated by the heavier boom of artillery and the distinctive whine of incoming mortars. Smoke columns rose from burning buildings, and the acrid smell of credite hung heavy in the air. Refugees streamed past them, carrying what few possessions they could manage, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The strategic importance of Taegu could not be overstated. The city served as the primary communication hub for the entire perimeter, with roads and railways radiating out like spokes of a wheel to connect the various defensive positions. It also housed the headquarters of the South Korean Army and served as a major supply depot for the United Nations forces. If Taegu fell, the defenders would lose their ability to coordinate their defense and resupply their units. Colonel John Michaelis, commanding the 27th Infantry Regiment, had been tasked with holding the city at all costs. His wolfhounds, as the regiment was known, had already earned a reputation for tenacious fighting during the earlier battles along the Nakdong River. But even these battle-hardened veterans were being pushed to their limits by the relentless North Korean pressure. The enemy's tactics were particularly effective in the urban environment. Small groups of North Korean soldiers would infiltrate through the maze of streets and alleyways, setting up ambushes and creating confusion in the American rear areas. Their use of camouflage was exceptional, and they had an uncanny ability to blend into the civilian population, making it difficult for the defenders to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. By noon, the situation had become critical. North Korean forces had penetrated to within 3 miles of the city center, and their artillery was beginning to fall among the supply dumps and command posts. The thunder of guns had become a constant background noise, and the ground trembled with each explosion. Mitchell could see the fear in his men's eyes as they prepared for what might be their final stand. The pre-dawn darkness of August 17, 1950, was shattered by the flash of muzzle blasts and the screaming whistle of incoming artillery shells. Along the Nakdong River, the 2nd Battalion of the 23rd Infantry Regiment was fighting for its life against a determined North Korean offensive that threatened to break through the western edge of the Psan perimeter. The battle that would unfold over the next several hours would test the courage and resolve of every man involved. Sergeant First Class Melvin Brown crouched in his foxhole, watching the shadowy figures of North Korean soldiers advancing through the morning mist. His machine gun crew had been holding this position for 3 days, and they were down to their last belt of ammunition. The enemy had been probing their defenses relentlessly, testing for weak points in the American line. Brown knew that if they broke through here, there would be nothing to stop them from reaching the main supply route that ran parallel to the river. The North Korean 4th Division had crossed the Nakdong River in force during the night, using improvised rafts and pontoon bridges to establish a significant bridgehead on the eastern bank. Their assault was part of a coordinated offensive aimed at crushing the United Nations forces before reinforcements could arrive from the United States. The timing was crucial. Every day that passed brought fresh troops and equipment to the defenders, making their task increasingly difficult. Brown's platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Hammond, crawled over to his position as mortar rounds began falling around them. The young officer's face was pale with exhaustion and strain, but his voice remained steady as he shouted over the noise of battle. "Brown, we need to hold this position at all costs. If they break through here, they'll roll up our entire line." The sergeant nodded grimly and adjusted his grip on the machine gun. He had been in combat since the beginning of the war, and he understood the stakes better than most. The men around him were mostly green replacements, fresh from training camps. In the United States, they had arrived in Korea with little understanding of what they were facing, and the reality of combat had hit them like a physical blow. As dawn broke fully, the scale of the North Korean assault became apparent. Hundreds of enemy soldiers were advancing across the open ground between the river and the American positions, supported by mortar fire and the deadly accurate shooting of their snipers. The distinctive crack of Soviet-made rifles echoed across the battlefield, and the whine of bullets passing overhead became a constant presence. The fighting was particularly fierce around Hill 205, a strategic elevation that dominated the surrounding terrain. Company Baker of the 23rd Infantry had established their command post on the hill's reverse slope, but they were now surrounded and fighting on three sides. Captain James Martinez, the company commander, had called for artillery support, but the North Korean advance was so rapid that the defenders were in danger of being overrun before help could arrive. According to combat records preserved in the National Archives, the battle for the Nakdong River crossing points represented one of the most critical moments of the entire Psan perimeter campaign. The North Korean forces had committed their best troops to this offensive, including veteran units that had fought in the Chinese Civil War and possessed extensive combat experience. Private First Class David Kim, a Korean-American soldier serving as an interpreter, found himself in the unique position of being able to understand enemy communications. As he huddled in a shell crater with two other soldiers, he could hear North Korean officers shouting orders to their troops. The information he gathered would prove invaluable in understanding enemy intentions and movements. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it the oppressive heat that would characterize the battle. Men fought with increasing desperation as ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. The sound of battle created a hellish symphony of destruction that would echo in the memories of survivors for decades to come. The afternoon of September 1st, 1950, marked a pivotal moment in the defense of the Psan perimeter. General Douglas MacArthur's bold gambit at Incheon was still 2 weeks away, but the signs of changing fortune were already becoming apparent along the embattled defensive line. The North Korean People's Army, despite their numerical superiority and initial success, was beginning to show signs of the strain that comes from sustained offensive operations. Without adequate supply lines, Colonel John Sloan, commanding the 5th Regimental Combat Team, stood in his command post overlooking the Nakdong River Valley, studying the latest intelligence reports with growing optimism. For the first time since the establishment of the perimeter, the enemy attacks were losing their coordinated precision. North Korean units were advancing piecemeal, without the overwhelming artillery support that had characterized their earlier assaults. More importantly, intercepted communications indicated that several enemy divisions were experiencing critical shortages of ammunition and fuel. The transformation had not come easily. The United Nations forces had paid a terrible price in blood and treasure to hold their ground. The casualty lists grew longer each day, and many units had been reduced to half their authorized strength. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, which had arrived in early August, had been thrown into the most critical battles and had suffered accordingly. Their aggressive counterattacks had blunted several North Korean penetrations, but at enormous cost. Staff Sergeant William Thompson, leading a platoon of the 24th Infantry Regiment, had witnessed the gradual shift in momentum firsthand. His unit had been holding a section of the perimeter near Haemun, where the fighting had been particularly savage. The North Korean attacks had come in waves, each one seemingly designed to test the resolve of the defenders. But Thompson had noticed subtle changes in enemy tactics over the past week. The attacks were becoming less frequent and more desperate, suggesting that the North Korean commanders were running out of reserves. The arrival of the 2nd Infantry Division from the United States had provided a much-needed boost to the defenders' morale. These fresh troops, while lacking combat experience, brought with them modern equipment and a determination to prove themselves in battle. Their presence allowed General Walker to begin rotating his battle-worn units out of the line for rest and refitting, a luxury that had been impossible during the darkest days of August. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Daniels, operations officer for the 25th Infantry Division, had been tracking the enemy's supply situation through aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. The intelligence picture that emerged was encouraging. North Korean supply lines stretched back over 200 miles to their bases in North Korea, and they were under constant attack from United Nations air power. The enemy's logistical system, never robust to begin with, was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure. The psychological impact on the North Korean forces was becoming increasingly evident. Prisoners captured during recent fighting spoke of low morale, inadequate food supplies, and growing doubts about the likelihood of victory. Many enemy soldiers were suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition, and their fighting effectiveness was diminishing accordingly. The initial enthusiasm that had carried them south to the gates of Psan was being replaced by a grim determination to survive. Weather conditions also began to favor the defenders. The oppressive heat of August gave way to cooler temperatures that made sustained combat operations more bearable. The monsoon rains that had turned roads into quagmires and hampered supply operations began to subside, allowing for better movement of men and materials. Air operations, which had been severely restricted by poor weather, resumed with increased intensity. As reported in contemporary military dispatches filed by war correspondents, the tide of battle was slowly but inexorably turning in favor of the United Nations forces. The North Korean army, which had seemed invincible just weeks earlier, was beginning to show the strain of extended operations far from their home bases. The crisp morning air of September 16, 1950, carried with it the sounds of a transformed battlefield. Instead of the defensive preparations that had characterized the previous 2 months, the Psan perimeter now buzzed with offensive activity. General Walker had issued orders for a limited counteroffensive, designed to push the North Korean forces back across the Nakdong River and establish a more defensible line. The psychological impact of taking the initiative after so many weeks of desperate defense could not be underestimated. Major Robert Casey, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Cavalry Regiment, led his men forward in the pre-dawn darkness toward their objective, Hill 303, a strategic elevation that had been in enemy hands for over a month. The hill commanded the approaches to the vital supply route that connected Taegu with the southern sectors of the perimeter. Its recapture would not only improve the tactical situation, but would also send a clear message to both friend and foe that the United Nations forces were no longer merely trying to survive. The assault began with a thunderous artillery barrage that lit up the eastern horizon like a man-made sunrise. The big guns of the 8th Army had been accumulating ammunition for weeks, and now they unleashed their fury on the North Korean positions. The distinctive whistle of incoming shells was followed by the earth-shaking explosions that tore through enemy fortifications. For the first time in the campaign, the United Nations forces enjoyed a significant advantage in artillery support. Captain Ellen Morrison, one of the few female officers serving in a combat zone, commanded a medical detachment that had been assigned to support the assault. As the wounded began arriving at her aid station, she was struck by the change in their demeanor. Instead of the hollow-eyed desperation that had characterized casualties during the dark days of August, these men displayed a fierce determination and confidence that had been absent for months. They spoke excitedly of advancing rather than retreating, of capturing ground rather than giving it up. The North Korean resistance was fierce but disorganized. Their communications had been severely disrupted by the artillery bombardment, and individual units found themselves fighting in isolation without coordination from higher command. The T-34 tanks that had been so effective during the earlier stages of the campaign were now being systematically destroyed by the new M26 Pershings, and the arrival of F-80 Shooting Star fighter bombers armed with rockets and napalm. Sergeant James O'Brien, a veteran of World War II who had fought in the Pacific, found himself leading a squad of young soldiers up the rocky slopes of Hill 303. The terrain was treacherous, with loose shale and hidden crevices that could turn an ankle or break a leg. Enemy snipers had positioned themselves among the rocks, and their accurate fire made every advance a deadly gamble. But O'Brien noticed something different about this battle. The North Korean defensive fire was less intense than it had been during previous engagements, suggesting that their ammunition supplies were running low. The breakthrough came at approximately 10:30 in the morning when elements of the 5th Cavalry Regiment succeeded in flanking the North Korean positions from the north. Caught between two advancing forces, the enemy defense began to crumble. Small groups of North Korean soldiers began surrendering, many of them showing signs of prolonged malnutrition and exhaustion. Their weapons were often in poor condition, and their uniforms were tattered and stained. Colonel Harrison Matthews, commanding the task force assigned to exploit the breakthrough, pushed his men forward with increasing urgency. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Korean forces were beginning a general withdrawal across the Nakdong River, and he was determined to prevent their escape. The opportunity to inflict significant casualties on the retreating enemy was too valuable to miss, as documented in official army records housed at the center of military history. The September counteroffensive marked the beginning of the end for North Korean hopes of conquering South Korea. The tide had turned decisively in favor of the United Nations forces, and the initiative would never again pass to the Communist forces. The morning of September 23, 1950, dawned clear and cool over the recaptured city of Daegu. The North Korean forces had been pushed back across the Nakdong River, and for the first time in months, the sound of artillery fire came from the enemy's side of the water rather than falling among the United Nations positions. The Psan perimeter, which had seemed like a death trap just weeks earlier, was now expanding daily as the defenders pushed their enemies back toward the 38th parallel. Colonel Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking female officer in the theater, surveyed the battlefield from her position in the divisional headquarters. As the chief intelligence officer for the 2nd Infantry Division, she had been instrumental in identifying the weaknesses in North Korean dispositions that had made the successful counteroffensive possible. Her reports had highlighted the enemy's deteriorating supply situation and the growing gaps between their units, information that had proved invaluable to the operational planners. The cost of victory had been staggering. The casualty reports that crossed Williams' desk each day told a story of sacrifice that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade had suffered over 60% casualties during their desperate fighting around the perimeter. The 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the first units to face the North Korean onslaught, had been virtually destroyed and rebuilt twice during the campaign. The human cost of holding the line had been almost beyond comprehension. Master Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez, a medic with the 3rd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, had witnessed the full spectrum of human courage and suffering during the battle. His aid station had treated over 400 wounded soldiers during the 2-month siege, and he had seen young men display extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. The memories of those who had died in his arms would remain with him forever, a constant reminder of the price of freedom. The North Korean losses had been even more severe. Intelligence estimates suggested that the enemy had lost over half of their effective combat strength during the failed offensive. Entire divisions had been reduced to regimental strength, and many units had simply ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. The roads leading north were littered with abandoned equipment and the remnants of what had once been a formidable military machine. Captain Michael Chen, a Chinese-American officer serving as a liaison with South Korean forces, had been particularly effective in coordinating the combined operations that had characterized the later stages of the battle. His ability to communicate with both American and Korean commanders had helped smooth the inevitable friction that rose when different military cultures attempted to work together. The South Korean forces had fought with remarkable tenacity, despite suffering from inadequate equipment and training. The civilian population of South Korea had paid perhaps the heaviest price of all. Hundreds of thousands of refugees had fled south ahead of the advancing North Korean forces, carrying with them only what they could manage. Many had been caught in the crossfire, and the exact number of civilian casualties would never be known. The city of Daegu itself bore the scars of battle, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and the infrastructure severely damaged. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. Lieutenant Sarah Johnson, a nurse with the 8th Army Medical Corps, had observed the changes in the men she treated. Many displayed the 1,000-yard stare that had become associated with combat veterans, their eyes reflecting experiences that could never be fully shared with those who had not been there. The bonds forged in battle were stronger than any peacetime relationships, creating a brotherhood of shared suffering and mutual dependence, as confirmed by historical accounts compiled by the United States Army Center of Military History. The Battle of the Psan perimeter had proven that American forces could adapt and overcome even when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The lessons learned during those desperate weeks would influence military doctrine. For generations to come, the victory had been complete, but it came at a cost that would resonate through the decades that followed. The final shots of the Battle of the Psan perimeter echoed across the Korean hills on October 1, 1950, as the last North Korean stragglers were either captured or driven back across the 38th parallel. The siege that had lasted 67 days was finally over, and the United Nations forces could begin to assess the magnitude of their achievement. What had begun as a desperate last stand had evolved into one of the most significant defensive victories in modern military history. General Walker stood once again on the same ridge where he had surveyed the approaching enemy forces. Just 2 months earlier, the view that greeted him now was dramatically different. Instead of enemy columns advancing through the dust, he saw American and South Korean forces moving north in pursuit of the retreating North Korean army. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, a testament to the courage and determination of the men who had held the line when all seemed lost. The strategic implications of the victory were profound. The successful defense of the Psan perimeter had provided the time and space necessary for General MacArthur to execute his brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon. On September 15th, the two-pronged offensive, the breakout from Psan and the landing at Incheon, had caught the North Korean forces in a massive pincer movement that had shattered their military capabilities. The war, which had seemed all but lost in August, had been transformed into a United Nations victory by October. Colonel James Thompson, who had commanded a battalion throughout the entire siege, reflected on the factors that had made victory possible. The superior firepower of the United Nations forces had been crucial, particularly the devastating effectiveness of American artillery and air power. The F-80 Shooting Stars and F-51 Mustangs had systematically destroyed North Korean supply lines and communication networks, gradually starving the enemy of the resources necessary to sustain their offensive operations. The role of logistics had been equally important. The port of Psan had remained open throughout the siege, allowing for the continuous flow of men, equipment, and supplies from the United States and other United Nations countries. The North Korean forces, operating at the end of extended supply lines that were under constant attack, had been unable to maintain their initial momentum. The battle had become a contest of endurance, and the United Nations forces had proved more resilient. Staff Sergeant Maria Garcia, who had served as a radio operator with the 8th Army headquarters, had witnessed the gradual improvement in coordination between the various United Nations forces. The early days of the battle had been marked by confusion and poor communication, but the shared experience of combat had forged effective working relationships between American, South Korean, British, and other allied units. The international character of the defense had sent a powerful message about the global commitment to resisting communist expansion. The individual stories of heroism and sacrifice that had emerged from the battle would become part of military legend. Sergeant First Class Melvin Brown, who had held his position along the Nakdong River despite overwhelming odds, was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. His example had inspired countless others to persevere when the situation seemed hopeless. The battle had produced dozens of such heroes, ordinary soldiers who had accomplished extraordinary things when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The lessons learned during the Psan perimeter would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The importance of combined arms operations, the value of superior firepower, and the crucial role of logistics had all been demonstrated in the most dramatic possible way. The battle had also shown that American forces could adapt quickly to new tactical situations and overcome initial disadvantage through determination and superior leadership. As documented in the official history compiled by the Department of the Army, the Battle of the Psan perimeter had marked a turning point, not only in the Korean War, but in the broader Cold War struggle between the democratic and communist worlds. The successful defense had demonstrated that the United States and its allies were prepared to fight to contain the spread of communism, establishing a precedent that would shape international relations for decades. The men who had fought and died along the Psan perimeter had earned their place in history. Through their courage and sacrifice, their legacy would live on in the free and prosperous South Korea that emerged from the ashes of war, a testament to the enduring value of the principles for which they had fought.